Stephen Jay Gould was an evolutionary biologist who taught at Harvard and was most active from the late 70s until his death in 2002. He had a lot of influence on the general public because he wrote books targeting a popular audience, appeared on talk shows, and had his own special on PBS. He was also Jewish, and a figure covered at length in The Cultural Critique by Kevin MacDonald. He's actually one of the main reasons that lots of regular people today are skeptical of IQ, despite the fact that basically everyone in the scientific community believes in it and actively uses it in their studies.
I really wonder about the whole quantifying intelligence thing.
Gould actually thought that human consciousness, intelligence, and the trend toward larger brain size in humans were accidents, and didn't actually help our ancestors survive. In the 1996 edition of his book, The Mismeasure of Man, Gould continued to state that G, general intelligence, is just a statistical artifact. He didn't address any of the significant criticism that had come out since the first edition of his book was released in 1981. So in other words, he didn't believe in IQ at all, and he thought that intelligence and human consciousness weren't helpful for our ancestors in surviving, that these things just arose by accident.
Why do you think American society is so obsessed with IQ?
I don't know that we're obsessed by it, but I think it arises largely in the context of the lamentable history of our racism.
Those beliefs aren't backed up at all by the scientific community. But what's more, he wasn't just wrong, he was dishonest. Despite the scientific community's widespread recognition of Gould's dishonesty, he was highly publicized as a public spokesperson on evolution and intelligence. Quote, he has come to be seen by non-biologists as the preeminent evolutionary theorist. In contrast, the evolutionary biologists with whom I have discussed his work tend to see him as a man whose ideas are so confused as to be hardly worth bothering with. All this would not matter were it not that he is giving non-biologists a largely false picture of the state of evolutionary theory. That's from John Maynard Smith. Unfortunately, it's hard to show someone, let alone prove to someone, what the scientific community at large believes. It's much easier to point to a Harvard scientist and say, look, he doesn't believe in IQ, so I don't believe in IQ either. Even if that guy is like a crazy outlier with tons more influence than he deserves. MacDonald cites many different distinguished scientists in the book just demolishing Gould. Dennett says that Gould used rhetoric and had a non-scientific agenda. Quote, Kamen and Gould present a highly exaggerated and largely false account of the general attitudes of the testing community on the subject of ethnic group differences in intelligence. The other thing about Gould is that he would be destructively skeptical. Quote, Gould offers no alternative ideas to account for all of these well-established observations. His mission in this area appears entirely nihilistic. So he would say, oh, IQ doesn't exist, none of these things matter, none of these things are actually there. But then he wouldn't actually supply any alternative to explain all of the things that IQ does actually explain. That's why it's a respected idea, because it has predictive power. That's how science works. To go any further, we should bring up Henry H. Goddard, a psychologist and eugenicist who preceded Gould. He was an early advocate of intelligence testing, and worked on a study investigating the heritability of, quote, feeble-mindedness. Gould viciously attacked Goddard in his book, The Mismeasure of Man. But it's not like it was a fair critique. Gould engaged in a single-minded pursuit of Goddard, presenting a false picture of Goddard as a rigid hereditarian or elitist. Gould ignored Goddard's published doubts, his qualifications, and his statements about the importance of the environment. He strawmanned him, basically. Gould was engaging in scholarly fraud. He would ignore passages that went against his points, and the quotes were often right next to other quotes that he would use. So Gould misled the public, intentionally. Why would he go and do something like that? Well, we already said he was Jewish. His family embraced Jewish culture. He learned Marxism from his father, and he was a Marxist throughout his life. Gould's family regularly read the Forward, which was a Yiddish daily newspaper that was radical in tone, left radical. Quote, it does not seem to me entirely implausible to suggest that Gould's passion against human sociobiology was linked to the fear that it was yet another tool which could be used for anti-Semitic purposes. I did ask Gould about this once. He did not entirely repudiate the idea, but inclined to think that the opposition stemmed more from Marxism, and as it so contingently happens, most American Marxists are from Eastern European Jewish families. Perhaps both factors were involved. So, frankly, to me, I don't particularly care whether he was trying to combat anti-Semitism or whether he believed these things because he was a Marxist. Either way, he wasn't believing them because they were scientifically valid. He was coming in with his prejudices as presuppositions, and he was arguing for things ultimately in bad faith, because in science you're supposed to be arguing things from a scientific perspective. And he would shield things in science, and he would use rhetoric and all of these different tools to try to ultimately hide the fact that he had an ethnic or philosophical interest in these things. Michael Ruse said that a very prominent theme of Gould's The Mismeasure of Man was how hereditarian views on intelligence had been used by, quote, Teutonic supremacists to discriminate against Jews early in the century. So that's it for Gould. There were actually a couple other figures, Richard Lerner and Kamen, who were addressed in the same chapter by Kevin MacDonald, and ultimately they're very similar. They're both Jewish, they're both radical, they both use deceptive tactics, and they were both especially concerned about the link between genetic testing of IQ and the genocide of Jews. Lerner actually wrote a book called Final Solutions: Biology, Prejudice, and Genocide. And so this wasn't just an isolated incident, this wasn't just Gould, it was a whole wave of influence that has, I think, to some degree been beaten back by the scientific community. So that's the end of this video. The next video will be on Chapter 3, Jews and the Left, so if that sounds interesting, don't forget to subscribe. Also, one thing we forgot to mention in the last video is if you're really enjoying the series, then buy the book. All the content's coming from there. There's a ton of great stuff in it that unfortunately we're not covering in these videos just because we're trying to make them short. So please, please, please buy the book. Support Kevin MacDonald. I'll put a link in the description. Thanks. I'll see you guys next time.